Welcome back to this special episode of Inside Iraq. My guest today is Larry Wilkerson. He was the former Chief of Staff of Secretary of State's Colin Powell. In his presentation in February 2003 to the Security Council, Powell talked about Ansar al-Islam. This is a small Islamic radical fringe group that they had a small base in northern Iraq, a part of Iraq that was not under the control of the Iraqi government or Saddam Hussein. How was it possible for Powell to extrapolate that Iraq is supporting terrorism, knowing full well that Baghdad's writ does not extend all the way to the border between Iraq and Iran?
Both the Secretary and I asked John McLaughlin and George Tenet and other analysts that they presented to us those questions about why were we looking at an area that should have been under the control of the Kurds, and obviously under our surveillance, because we virtually, in terms of the no-fly zones, were owners of the southern and northern portions of Iraq. And the answers we got were that that was a wild and woolly area in Iraq, and that no one, not even the Kurds, really had constant visibility over that area, and that's the reason they had selected it. The terrorist group had selected it to be its poison factory, where it put together various chemicals and so forth to make poisons. And that was the extent of the information that the intelligence community gave to the Secretary.
And how would he tie it to Baghdad?
Well, it wasn't necessarily tied to Baghdad so much.
The way it came out in the presentation that...
yeah, well, actually it was tied to Iraq. And if you tie it to Iraq, you've tied it by implication to Baghdad.
And he mentioned also Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi being in Baghdad or frequent appearer to Iraq, and that turned out to be also not true.
Well, we went through quite a bit of discussion about that with the Secretary, with myself and Mr. Tenet and Mr. McLaughlin and others. And the conclusion we came to was that at least what we believed that they were telling us was Zarqawi was seeking some sort of medical treatment in Baghdad, and that because of the fact that no one could be in Baghdad without Saddam Hussein's people knowing it, that Saddam Hussein was essentially a host while he was there receiving medical treatment.
Coming to the ace in the hole, the pièce de résistance within the administration, the presentation that, as outlined by Powell at the Security Council, was the mobile lab. Was he really convinced that Iraq had those labs? We only saw sketches. There was no hard evidence at all that Baghdad has it.
Well, as I said before, we were presented with 4 different sources, each of which had, independent of one another, corroborated the presence of the labs. Not just what we eventually showed, which was a mock-up of trucks that plied Iraq's highways and had high positions in Iraq, but also on rail cars that were in certain hide areas also. And on these rail cars and in these trucks, which constituted a less than 1% portion of the trucks that plied the roads of Iraq, for example, virtually unfindable, these facilities were available to make, on the spot, if you will, batches of biological weapons. And it came across from the CIA analysts, who, remember now.
These are actually U.S. sources. These 4 sources actually...
No, these 4 sources were not revealed to us in terms of whether they were run by the British, run by the United States, run by Germany, run by Jordan, run by the INC. They were not revealed to us, except that because they were trying to protect their sources and methods, except that they were sources with impeccable credentials, and that they independently corroborated each other. Now, the one that was revealed to us in some detail was an Iraqi major who had actually worked in one of these laboratories. He had been present when an accident occurred in the laboratory, had injured and even killed some people, and he was the one who was able, because of having worked into the laboratory, to sketch for the CIA artist exactly what you saw presented at the UN, the sketches of the mobile biological laboratories. So this was a very convincing presentation.
Did he pan out to be right? Or was he
It turned out apparently to have been curveball camouflaged, so the Secretary of State would not see that it was curveball, would not see that it was a source in Germany, would not see that the Germans had possession of him and not us, would not see the things, the details that would normally be available. He was camouflaged as a source that was impeccable.
Now, all along, this begs a question. Colin Powell, a man who spent all his years of life in the service of his country. And here again, he's presenting the case for his country, the Security Council. And he's putting his personal credibility, let alone the credibility of the United States. Now with the benefit of hindsight and 4 years in research, and now you are teaching most of this here in the Virginia area, was it a deliberate machination by part of the US government to make Powell a fall guy, or was it just circumstances conspired against him?
At the time that we made the presentation and in the months that came later when Mr. Tenet and Mr. McLaughlin had to call the Secretary and tell him that major pillars in his presentation were false, I thought that it was just a colossal intelligence failure. I still think that was a major part of it. And not just a failure on the part of the United States, but also some of our friends and allies. But after, as you said, doing a lot of research, listening to people, talking to people, looking at some of the data that's come out, I can't explain especially those two instances, the one of curveball, the other with regard to Sheikh al-Libi, because the Defense Intelligence Agency dissented on Sheikh al-Libi's confession immediately because it was gained under coercion. I can't explain why those two in particular, very important parts of his presentation, weren't made available to Secretary Powell at the time so that he could make a decision as to whether or not he included them in his presentation. So I have to conclude now that there was some, not just politicization of intelligence, some cherry picking of intelligence, which I've always thought there was, but I have to conclude now that there were some people in this process who actually colluded to make a false picture and make that.
This is a deliberate effort in order to trap Colin Powell.
Well, not necessarily to trap Colin Powell, more accurately to trap the international community and the American people in the UN Security Council into voting for a war with Iraq.
Because the people in the Middle East, as well as the rest of the world, they have the following theory. When Colin Powell went to George Bush, as the drum for war was beating, that you need an international cover, you need a United Nations resolution, otherwise it's not going to pan out, it's not going to work out. People surrounding the president, Dick Cheney, Feith, Wolfowitz, they said, if that's what the secretary wants, international cover, legitimacy, let us give it to him and let's put him in front of the Security Council. Do you buy that argument? Somehow he got what he wanted, but in the process he was cheated.
I buy the argument something a little bit more sophisticated than you just delivered it.
Let me hear
I
it.
buy the argument something like this. The Vice President of the United States, who was the most powerful member of this administration from 2001 to 2004 when I observed it, the Vice President of the United States essentially weighed in and must have said something like this: Powell wants to go to the UN, let him go. If he fails, no harm done. If he succeeds, then we'll have their support. And so Powell was sent to the United Nations to deliver the message of circumstantial evidence that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and therefore presented, if not an imminent, certainly a considerable threat to the United States and to the region. Colin Powell was sent, unlike Adlai Stevenson being sent during the Cuban Missile Crisis, arguably a much more serious crisis. Colin Powell was sent, the Secretary of State was sent because he had high poll ratings and the most credibility of anyone in the administration. And that's the only conclusion I think anyone who's not naive must come to these days.
Iraq is in a crisis now. The United States is in crisis right now. Almost it's a catch-22. They cannot leave, then they cannot stay. Now with the benefit of hindsight, 4 years of research, and before that you were in the very heart of the US political decision-making. Why was it? What was the very reason for the war? Was it oil? Was it forward bases? Was it a war of choice? Exactly how would you describe this, what Madeleine Albright said, the worst single American misadventure in the history of the United States since the creation of the Republic?
First, let me tell you that I knew there were going to be problems because I was with Powell in 1990 and 91 when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and we talked another President Bush out of going to Baghdad. And I knew all the reasons we had come up with to persuade the president that he shouldn't go to Baghdad. That is to say, quit while you're ahead. So here we fast forward to 2002 and 2003, and I'm listening to arguments that we are going to Baghdad now, that we are going to take Iraq, a nation of some 20+ million people, and we're going to essentially own that nation. So I had ample reservations even at that time. But looking back on it, as you said now, I think you have to ask me, which person advising President Bush are you talking about before I can give you a motivation? And let me just give you some examples. I think with Paul Wolfowitz, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the motivation was freedom and democracy, utopia, that sort of thing. It also was very much the oil. Paul Wolfowitz even said that Iraq was swimming in oil. So if you look at others like the Vice President, then I have to tell you that I think the principal reason again was both oil and the nexus of potential nuclear weapons in particular, but WMD in general, and terrorist groups. If you're looking at other people in the administration, Colin Powell, for example, I think the motivation was closing off a policy that was becoming increasingly a failure. The sanctions regime was failing. We, after all, hadn't ended the war in '91. All Norm Schwarzkopf had done in the desert was sign a ceasefire. And so for Colin Powell, it was bringing closure to a policy that was increasingly failing against a threat that, while it might not be imminent, still needed to be dealt with. For others in the administration, the motivations were different things. The motivation, for example, for Douglas Feith, I think, was Israel. I think Douglas Feith probably was indeed a card-carrying member of the Likud party.
On that note, Mr. Wilkerson, perhaps I can tell you that is the dominant sentiment in the Middle East. All along it was oil and Israel. Thank you for being on this special episode of Inside Iraq.
Sure.
That's all the time we have for this week. Join me next week when we take another look inside Iraq. Goodbye.